No one should be fooled. They're not supporters of the Palestinian people, neither the Erdogan regime nor the regime in Qatar. Neither of them are pro-Palestinian. They are firmly in the American camp, as opposed to their people. The people of Turkey are staunch supporters of the Palestinian cause, but the regime in Ankara, they are in the American camp. The hug when the Qatari and the Turkish officials hugged the Israelis, they basically whitewashed the Holocaust. And even attending this disgraceful and despicable meeting was an insult to all the martyrs and the women and children who were massacred in the Holocaust. And it was whitewashing Trump's crimes, just so that they could get into his good books. Everyone should support the resistance. And the resistance had every reason to accept a ceasefire under its own terms. And we should all continue to support it. The pressure that they feel is enormous. But for these countries to continue to do business and trade with the Israeli regime after 2 years of Holocaust, for any country to have anything to do with the Israelis, I mean, the Qatari regime was just bombed. A Qatari citizen was killed, and then they go and hug these ethno-supremacists. And the same is true with the Erdogan's allies who were in that session, his people hugging the Israelis. Just being there was an insult to the martyrs and the victims of the Holocaust. Yes, we all support the ceasefire in the way in which the resistance is pursuing this ceasefire, but to give any sort of concession or to show thanks and gratefulness to the American regime or to the Israeli regime is just, for me, it's just something beyond my comprehension.
Netanyahu, he has ruled out any Turkish and Qatari involvement in Gaza's post-war administration. What is that, Professor Marandi? What is the plan? It seems to me that during the interview with Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, they're planning to reconstruct Gaza and settle, you bring in these settlers to Gaza, little by little, gradually. That's the plan. That's the master plan on their part. It's not just about reconstruction of Gaza. It's something beyond that, but they want to do it, wrap it up in something beautiful, something that makes them capable to sell it to the world. Is that possible?
There won't be any reconstruction for the Palestinian people. And the reason why the Israeli regime can say no to Erdogan and to the regime in Doha is because he knows that they can't do anything about it. Are they going to help the resistance? We know that they've never given a single bullet to the resistance. They do trade. They do business. Oil goes through Turkey to Israel. Ships go back and forth despite pretending otherwise. The Qatari regime, of course, does extensive cooperation with the regime. They, along with other oil and gas-rich family dictatorships in the Persian Gulf, give money to the likes of Kushner and to the likes of Witkoff, and they invest in Israel. They invest in occupied Palestine. We all know that. This is nothing that they can hide. So why should the Israeli regime give them any concession easily when they pose no threat to the regime, where they have no leverage against the Israeli regime? When the Iranians, as we speak, the Iranians continue to support Hamas. Where do you think the money comes or the equipment comes to make more tunnels? And they're not just, they need support to be able to fight for 2 years. The same is true with Yemen, with the resistance in Lebanon and elsewhere. So when they don't support them, they have no leverage anyway. But the point is, why should they even want to be a part of a process that the Americans have defined and that the Israelis have defined? They should be fully against any element of this ceasefire plan that goes against the demands of the Palestinian people. All of Gaza has to be liberated. And the Palestinian people have to have full authority over their own land. And the Israeli regime must be expelled. How can they do that? Break off ties with the Israeli regime. Stop doing business and trade. And people across the region and beyond have a responsibility to put pressure on governments. People across Europe are doing it. We saw enormous protests in Italy, in Spain, and elsewhere. People have to put pressure. These governments obviously don't reflect public opinion. They don't reflect the needs of the Palestinian people. So ultimately, there should be no collaboration or cooperation with Trump or with Kushner or with Witkoff, let alone with Netanyahu, let alone hugging Israel. After they've carried out a genocide, they hug these people? It's, again, it's just something I cannot comprehend. How are you, forget the issue of the two-state solution and the single-state solution. How is anyone going to have leverage to force the Israeli regime to withdraw from Gaza if there isn't real pressure? How can you have trade with the Israeli regime? How can you have political ties with the Israeli regime? How can you sell them oil or import gas from such a regime and then expect it to back down? It's not going to do that. The only thing that will make the Israeli regime back down and the regime in Washington back down and all the collaborators back down is for there to be resistance. And the resistance puts pressure, and that pressure causes them to step back.
I don't know if there is anybody in the West who has any sort of leverage on Netanyahu, because during the interview, again, they confessed, if they're honest in the way that they talk about this attack on Doha, they said they were shocked, they were surprised by the Israeli attack on Doha. And Trump called them and somehow said that what they're doing, this is not going to benefit Israel. This sort of behavior. Do you think, is there anybody in the United States who have leverage on Netanyahu? If the president of the United States doesn't know what's going on with Israel, what would be the next plan on their part? How do you see the sort of relationship they have between the United States under the Trump administration and Netanyahu?
They have leverage. They choose not to use it. Trump, in his really ridiculous speech in the Knesset, admitted that when Adelson wanted to see him, he'd tell him this is not how it works, but then he would come and see him anyway. And he would give him concession after concession. And he admitted that Adelson, his wife, and Adelson himself, that they cared about Israel, not the United States. Their priority was the Israeli regime. They're not faithful or patriotic Americans. So Trump was admitting that he's doing this for the Israeli regime. He's Israel first. That's a huge admission. He has the leverage, he chooses not to use it. Just as Turkey and Qatar and Egypt and the Emirates and all these countries, they have leverage. If they break off all ties with the Israeli regime, Netanyahu is weakened. The West is weakened, and more pressure is put on Netanyahu to change course. There's no doubt about that. So the leverage exists, but the pressure is not being, these regimes, these regional regimes that are basically collaborators, they pretend to be pro-Palestinian. I mean, the circus in Egypt was just painful to watch. It was painful to watch. These leaders go there and act like I don't want to be insulting on your show. So, but act in a way which, where Trump is basically the master and they're like, he's the ringmaster and they're in the circus. That's how it is. That's how it looked. So that leverage exists, but with these leaders, with these governments, with these collaborators, of course that leverage decreases. What leverage does have an impact? The leverage of the resistance in Lebanon, the leverage of the resistance in Iran, in Yemen. That has an impact. The pressure that the Yemenis put on the Israeli economy, the regime's economy, was enormous. That's why the Americans attacked Yemen. If it wasn't enormous, they wouldn't have attacked Yemen. They wouldn't have slaughtered innocent Yemeni citizens. And yet they failed. And as a result, the pressure continued. If that was not effective, the Americans wouldn't have attacked. If the resistance in Lebanon was not causing the Israeli regime enormous difficulty, they would not have carried out those massive genocidal attacks with the support of their Western allies and their collaborators inside Lebanon. If Iran's support for the Palestinian people was not very effective, its direct and indirect support, they would not have attacked Iran and faced a humiliating defeat after 12 days. So pressure works. Pressure creates leverage. But if someone does not want to use that leverage in the hope that he can get a better business deal with Trump or a better tariff deal, then that person is using the Palestinian people and Palestinian blood for his own personal gain.
You know what? You talk about the leaders who from the West Asia who participated in the summit, but look at the European leaders, the way that they're behaving in Ukraine. They're somehow pushing, they're trying to show some sort of leverage on Donald Trump when it comes to Europe. But in the summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, you see they've been used as the background decoration for Donald Trump. They did nothing but being in the background. What is that? How all of a sudden they've lost their power, their sort of negotiation leverage, or somehow the way that they're communicating toward Ukraine, they're not that much powerful when it comes to Gaza, to the Middle East? What's that?
This is far worse than what we saw with the Europeans going to Washington and sitting there like school children. They humiliated themselves, the European leaders. No doubt. But what these people did was they not only humiliated themselves, but they whitewashed a genocide. They whitewashed the Holocaust. They whitewashed the Holocaust. The war in Ukraine has far more casualties than in Gaza. But there, it's a battlefield where men are killing men. Horrible. And it should end tomorrow. And the Europeans should end this proxy war. But here we know that the Israeli regime is targeting children. They pulled the plug on incubators. They bomb hospitals. If the Russians wanted to do that, there would be no Kiev today. We all know that. The West knows that too. The Israelis' focus is on women and children. It's on ordinary people. They bomb ordinary people because they are Amalek, because they are subhuman, because they want them exterminated. They want them gone. We've seen them say it. We see that in the South African complaint to the ICJ. It's open. Their leaders have said that. They say it all the time in the media. They're, as we speak in the West Bank, they're doing the same thing. They attack people, they kill people, they beat up old women, they steal land. The army helps bring in these colonizers, these settlers. They steal, they kill, they graze on Palestinian land. And the West pretends that they believe in human rights and civil society and private ownership. And It's all nonsense. It's all fake. But what these leaders did in Egypt was far worse. What the European leaders belittled themselves and belittled their countries. These leaders that attended, they belittled especially regional leaders. Those who came from far away, I guess they comprehended less what was really happening. But regional leaders, they humiliated themselves, they humiliated their countries, but more importantly, they whitewashed a Holocaust.
There is an interview with the former Mossad and IDF who won various awards in the United States. He said that we're going to remove Palestinians from Gaza. It doesn't matter if they attack us or not. We're going to attack ourselves and we're going to put the blame on Gazans. So if they decide to go in that direction, do you think that the war with Iran would be some sort of distraction for them, for Israelis, to go all in Gaza?
Well, I think there's no doubt that they're going to try to exterminate the Palestinian people in Gaza. That is their objective, to expel the survivors and take the land. There's no doubt about that. And the West knows that. That's been the plan all along. Even from the beginning, when there was the talk of a two-state solution, that was always the plan. The West only tried to buy time for the Israeli regime. I remember Alistair Crook, who's been on your show. He told me that years ago, when the Israelis began bringing in these colonizers, these settlers in the West Bank, he went and saw some of those places, and he said they were the most fanatical of the fanatical Zionists. They put those people in the West Bank. Why? Because they wanted to make sure that they will never leave peacefully. So Alistair, of course, being a very decent person and human being, pointed this out. But the European politicians and diplomats who we see today making statements and who for years have been talking about the two-state solution, they knew very well what was happening. And they closed their eyes because they support the Israeli regime in its ethnic cleansing of the West Bank. And the daily murders that we see in the West Bank, when they shoot kids and murder kids and batter old women, beat them in the head with clubs. Where are all those Western human rights organizations and women's rights organizations? They're all fake. Those NGOs, those well-funded activists, they're all fake. The real activists are the ones who were arrested when their flotilla was taking infant formula for Gazan children. Those are the real activists, not the ones who've been silent for the last 2 years, who've been barking about human rights and women's rights for years when it serves the interests of the empire and getting good funding for it, and then silent when old women in the West Bank are beaten in the heads with clubs. It's all fake. And the fate of the West Bank is the same as the fate of Gaza. And that is that there's a war going on where the empire and the Zionist regime want to ethnically cleanse these lands, because the objective is, of course, and has always been Greater Israel. It has always been and always will be Greater Israel. And it won't even stop at Gaza or the West Bank, as we've seen in Syria, as we've already seen how they've annexed, because of Trump, the Golan Heights, and they will do more if they can. So the only way forward is resistance. And those who, again, took part in this shameful monkey show in Egypt, they helped the Israeli regime. They gave it a lifeline. They gave it some breathing space, to their eternal shame. But in any case, the objective is, of course, without a doubt, whether just like what we saw the other day, yesterday, when the two Israelis got killed because of their own stupidity, and then the regime decided to bomb the whole entire Gaza. Do you think that's not going to happen again? when the time comes and they feel ready, they'll make an excuse. Western media, the BBC, CNN, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Guardian, the Independent, France 24, all of these Western media outlets will repeat Israeli lies about Hamas carrying out some sort of terrorist attack or some deed carried out by someone, and then the Israelis would respond. They will try to frame it in a way to make it as legitimate as possible. And yes, it is possible that they will strike at Iran, because Iran is the only sincere supporter of the axis of resistance and the people of Palestine, along with Yemen, and to distract attention away from their failures elsewhere. That's what these escalations were about in the first place. Netanyahu has always needed escalation to stay in power. And the escalation that we saw yesterday was also beneficial to his court case, as we saw. And his day in court was again put back. So yes, escalation could take place, but Iran is much more prepared today. Iran has the advantage of having been a victim of an all-out attack by the Israeli regime with all of its capabilities. So Iran has learned from its mistakes. It will strengthen its strong points, and it will deal with its weaknesses so that next time round it can hit the Israeli regime much harder and more decisively with less pain at home. So if the Israeli regime is foolish, they'll attack Iran. But in any case, this is a genocidal regime that does not accept borders or boundaries. It does not accept international law. It does not even accept ceasefires. The ceasefire is just a word. This is not a ceasefire. They will continue to kill, and they will continue to violate their side of the bargain, and they will justify it, and the West will repeat whatever false claims and arguments that they make.
Professor Marandi, how prepared is Iran if Israel decides to attack Iran? We've learned, I don't know if that's right, but from the news we've learned that Iran has received MiG-29, the latest version, and Su-35, and Iranian offensive, capabilities are still intact. As the supreme leader of Iran has mentioned that Iran is prepared to use, the missiles, the new generations of missiles in Iran if Israel attacks Iran. What's your take on that?
Well, Ayatollah Khamenei gave an important speech yesterday, and people should go and read it. They can see parts of it on his Twitter accounts, but they can also look at his website. I think it was a significant speech. Yes, the Iranian offensive capability today is much stronger. It's continuing to develop its missiles. Iran refrained from using its most advanced missiles last time round because they wanted to have cards up their sleeves. And they learned a great deal about the Israeli regime's capabilities, and they still won. And the reason why the Israelis have not attacked is because it's too costly. If they thought that they could win, they would never have pleaded for a ceasefire in the first place. They were winning. If the Americans and the Israeli regime were winning, they would have no incentive to halt the attacks. Just like in Gaza, the so-called ceasefire plan of Trump was only put forward because they were not winning. The ceasefire that the Israeli regime insisted on with Lebanon was because it was not winning. And of course, the Lebanese government, being weak and complicit and a tool of the West, after the ceasefire, they allowed the Israeli regime to take territory and to continue bombing the country. Otherwise, the resistance did not allow them to take any territory, any of the villages. Whatever happened after the ceasefire. Of course, Hezbollah lives in a country which is mixed, which has many players, and where the West has huge influence. It's not like Gaza, where the resistance has full control of that territory and the people there are united, more or less. So, if the Israeli regime could attack Iran and believe that it would win, it would do so. It would do so today. I think that as time goes by, Iran becomes stronger compared to the Israeli regime. The only thing that could cause Netanyahu to attack Iran is his own interests. Because Netanyahu cares about Netanyahu. He doesn't care about the Israeli regime. Otherwise, he, more than anyone else in the history of this evil regime, has diminished it, has ruined it, has destroyed its credibility and its image across the world. He has brought it closer to destruction than anyone else. And it's all about his own selfish interests. So if he does attack Iran, he will lose. But he will carry it out because he needs a war.
Professor, what is the future of JCPOA, Iran together with Russia and China trying to, make their political move? But how do you see the future of JCPOA?
The JCPOA is dead. It's finished. And the Europeans are the biggest losers. Because the JCPOA was what made the Europeans relevant to Iran. That they could play a role in negotiating and have a foothold inside the country. That's gone. They destroyed it themselves. They failed to abide by their commitments, and then they tried to hurt Iran and do injustice to Iran. So now they're out of the picture. So the Europeans in general, they're the big losers on all fronts. When it comes to Russia, when it comes to China, when it comes to Iran, they're the big losers. And they will increasingly become weaker and less significant in the years to come. But the JCPOA is dead. And the Russians and the Chinese have made a very admirable statement, along with the Iranians, saying that they do not accept the snapback because the West did not abide by its commitments. It wasn't Iran, it was the West. And they have no legitimate right to use the snapback mechanism. And they did not even use the snapback mechanism as it is defined within the nuclear deal. So they put out a statement saying, we do not accept it. And so the West, on the one hand, says that the snapback has been used. The Russians and the Chinese say no. It's over. And the nuclear deal is over, so there will be no snapback. The non-aligned movement just recently, they too put out a statement supporting Iran's position. But the important thing really is in the case of the snapback are the Russians and the Chinese, because they're permanent members of the UN Security Council. And also these two countries do work with Iran when it comes to military cooperation and trade. Iran exports weapons to Russia, Russian exports weapons to Iran, and of course Iran increasingly is working with China as well. The JCPOA's sanctions are all covered by the US maximum pressure sanctions. And the only thing that would make a difference would be with regards to military cooperation. But the Russians and the Chinese do not accept it. So the JCPOA, the snapback mechanism that the Europeans tried to use, is not going to make any major impact. It's not going to have a major impact on the Iranian economy. And after time, it will just, people will forget that this happened. It had a psychological effect for a few weeks. That psychological effect, as I'm sure you've noticed, is dying down, and it will disappear. So the big losers are the Europeans, because they could have used the JCPOA to improve ties with Iran, to play a role. They chose not to do so, and they're not going to get that role ever again for the foreseeable future.
Yeah. Do you think that Europe sees itself as being as a part of the foreign policy of the United States, or they want to be somehow independent from the United States? Where is that, when it comes to Europe, as you've mentioned in Ukraine, they're pushing for something that would not benefit Europe in a long run. In the Middle East as well, Professor Marandi, as you've mentioned with the case of JCPOA, is Europe anymore? Because look at the energy. They don't have the energy, the resources. The technology is just moving away from Europe. what is the future for Europe? We know the people in Europe, they're concerned about what's going on, but the leaders in Europe, they don't care about what's going on in Europe.
Well, the Iranians have seen how unimportant the Europeans are because when Trump left the JCPOA during his first presidency, the Europeans promised to find a solution to have the JCPOA work, and they did nothing. And then this time round, when they negotiated with the Iranians, they made promises. And so the Iranians signed the deal in Cairo to cooperate with the International Atomic Energy Agency, but the Europeans then backed down. They refused to do what they said they would do because the Americans told them they can't. The Iranians knew this, by the way, and that's why the Iranians went forward with the agreement in Cairo, because they knew that the Europeans would not fulfill their side of the bargain. They knew that they were weak. And every time the Europeans negotiated with the Iranians and came to some sort of agreement, the Americans, Washington would veto it. So for the Iranians, it's clear that the Europeans are unimportant. Now, when it comes to Ukraine, it's not as if the Europeans are taking a different stance from Washington. Which Washington? The deep state in the United States, which pushed for this conflict in the first place, they haven't disappeared. They're working with a different faction than the Trump faction or the faction that supports Trump. But they're still, their hope is to get back to the years where someone like Biden was in charge. Otherwise, the Europeans are ineffective when it comes to Ukraine. They have no solution. They have no solution when it comes to China. They have no alternative plan. Even in Ukraine, as they disagree with Trump, they're not going to stand up against Trump. They're going to make it better for Trump. He'll sell them the weapons. They'll pay out of their own pocket. He'll make money. That's not standing up against the United States. That's empowering the United States. That's sacrificing your own people to empower Trump. And the same is true with China. Instead of the Europeans seeking a new partnership with China in the face of U.S. tariffs, they antagonize China. Europe is, as I said, it's on the decline. We see German industries in crisis. We see that the car manufacturers in Germany are in serious trouble, and it's going to just get worse. It's not going to get any better. So Europe is going to be an increasingly insignificant player. Probably the European Union will break up, maybe not into 30 pieces, but it will not be like it is today. I think Europe is going to be a increasingly less important player or set of players in the years to come, compared to BRICS countries and Shanghai Cooperation Organization countries, and those regimes that cling to the United States and the West and try to remain in Trump's good books and to work with the Europeans and prioritize them over the global majority. I think they are going to, in the long run, be losers, unless they change course.
Yeah. Witkoff, in the last minutes of this interview he had with 60 Minutes, he said that he feels optimistic about the relationship between the United States and Iran. Does Iran feel the same way?
No, of course not. The United States has murdered General Soleimani, the person who was leading the war against ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, who was key in saving the region from these extremist Takfiri terrorists that the West supports. They murdered him and his team, and they murdered his counterpart in Iraq and his team. No one is going to forget that. And then the United States tried to deceive Iran, negotiate with Iran while it was conspiring under Trump with Netanyahu to attack Iran. And then the United States struck Iranian targets. There's no reason to feel that the relationship between the United States and Iran will change. But the most important thing for the Iranians is the genocide in Gaza. How can we have a good relationship with a genocidal regime? That's the reason why Iran refused to participate in Cairo, because it was whitewashing the genocide. Instead of putting pressure on the United States, they eased pressure. Instead of putting more pressure on Netanyahu, they eased the pressure. So no, the relationship with the United States is not going to change, at least not in the near future, and any change would probably be small in the long run. One day we may have a different relationship with the United States altogether. There's no, the Iranians have no problem with Americans or with a country called the United States of America. The Iranian leader said, Ayatollah Khamenei, more than once, but somewhat recently, he said, the reason why when people say death to America, they don't mean ordinary Americans. They mean this regime that carries out genocide, this regime that batters nation after nation. Just like in Latin America, when they would say Yankee go home, they didn't mean that anyone who was a U.S. passport holder should leave and go back to the United States. They meant that the regime in Washington, which carries out aggression, which does not have any respect for the sovereignty of nations, which murders and plunders and rapes, it is unwelcome. It is despised. And we see that reemerging, manifesting itself today in the Caribbean, where they just bomb boats shamelessly. And the American media, which is complicit, just like it's complicit in the genocide in Gaza, they're not outraged. They're not ashamed. They just sit there and report the news. Whereas children lose parents and innocent people are murdered. We already know that some of the victims were not even Venezuelan. Yet the United States has a regime that has no moral compass, which is aggressive and brutal, continues to behave as a brutal and immoral regime would behave. So there's no reason for the relationship between Iran and the United States to fundamentally change under these circumstances. But a Zionist, a genocidal Zionist like Witkoff, you wouldn't understand that.
Yeah. Since you've mentioned Venezuela before wrapping up, Professor Marandi, do you think that the United States' main goal, what is the main goal in Venezuela? It's about oil and resources of Venezuela, or do you see something beyond that?
Yes, I think it's regime change. I think it's Venezuelan resources. We have to remember that the United States, it has again said that it wants to strengthen its hegemony over the Americas, over North and South America and Central America. So this would fall within that framework as well.
Monroe
I don't think
you're talking about.
Yes, but also more recently, the United States has reaffirmed that they want to refocus on the Western Hemisphere, on North and South America. So I think it is regime change. I think it's going to be not in the interest of the regime in Washington. I think it's going to be much more costly than they anticipate in their arrogance. But that is how the United States works. They still live in their bubble. They still think that they are the global superpower. And all of their actions, whether in Gaza or Ukraine or Latin America or the trade wars with China and India and everyone else, all of that is diminishing this empire very swiftly. I don't think the Americans are going to succeed in Latin America, but I think that they, like Witkoff, they live in their bubble, and as long as they're in that bubble, anything can happen.
Yeah.
And by the way, Nima, because I have to respond to Larry, even though the things that we've been discussing are pretty dark, but I had the fortune to meet Larry and Scott and the judge in Moscow. And Larry did give me a shirt to wear for your show, but I'm on campus today. So although it would be very difficult for me to wear it, but I'll be forced to wear it next week.